She kissed the most feared duke on his wedding day, unaware she was saving him from his fiancée's poisoned lips. The cathedral doors burst open. Every head turned. Standing at the entrance was Melanie Kennedy, a seamstress, a nobody breathless, hair falling from her bun, hands shaking inside a borrowed green dress that did not belong to her world. The priest had just said the words, "You may now kiss your bride." And the most feared duke in the Northern Empire, Adam O'Neill, a man carved from ice, dressed in black and gold like a king, who answered to no one, was leaning toward his bride. Melanie's legs moved before her mind caught up. She pushed through the crowd. She passed the guards. She reached the altar. And then, in front of 500 witnesses, she grabbed the duke's face and kissed him. The room stopped breathing. Isabel Grant, the bride standing inches away in white lace and diamonds, clenched her fist so tight her knuckles turned pale. What no one in that cathedral knew, not the guests, not the guards, not even the Duke himself, was that Melanie had not just crashed a wedding. She had stopped a murder. But what happens when the man you just saved decides you are the criminal? If you're ready for more stories where the unexpected happens, where the forgotten rise, and where the underdogs turn the game around, hit that subscribe button right now. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from and what's on your mind. Your thoughts are always welcome here, and I'd love to hear your take on tonight's story. Don't forget to like, share, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a moment of the drama, the revenge, and the secrets waiting to be uncovered. Welcome to the family. This is Forbidden Secret Love Chronicles. Now, let's dive in. The morning of the wedding, Melanie Kennedy woke before the sun did. That was nothing unusual. She had been waking before the sun for 11 years, ever since the fever took her mother and left her the oldest living soul in a house with 3 younger mouths to feed. Sleep was a luxury, and luxuries were not something a seamstress from the lower quarter of the city could afford to hold on to for long. She rose, splashed cold water on her face from the clay basin by the window, and began gathering her tools. Needle case, thread box. The small pair of silver scissors her father had given her the year before. Everything went wrong. She wrapped them carefully, the way she always did, and tucked them into the worn leather satchel that had carried her trade across half the city. Today was different from her usual work, though. Today she had been summoned to Grant Manor. The invitation had arrived 3 days ago, delivered by a footman in a uniform so pressed it looked painful. The Grant household required a seamstress of precision and discretion for final alterations to Miss Isabel Grant's wedding gown. The pay offered was more than Melanie earned in 2 months of ordinary work. She had said yes before the footman finished reading the letter aloud. She told herself it was practical. Her youngest brother needed new boots before winter, and the roof above the back bedroom had developed a leak that wept steadily whenever it rained. It was practical. It was necessary. It had nothing to do with the way her hands trembled slightly as she passed through the iron gates of the Grant estate and heard them close behind her, like a mouth swallowing her whole. Isabel Grant's dressing room was everything Melanie had imagined wealth looked like, and then some. The walls were hung with pale blue silk. The vanity table was wider than Melanie's entire kitchen, covered in bottles and brushes and small velvet boxes arranged with the obsessive order of someone who controlled everything within reach. The wedding gown itself was already on the form when Melanie arrived, and it was extraordinary. White lace so fine it looked like frozen breath. A bodice worked with hundreds of tiny seed pearls. A train that pooled on the floor like a slow tide. Melanie set down her satchel and got to work. Isabel arrived 20 minutes later, sweeping in with the particular energy of a woman who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around her presence. She was beautiful in the way that certain dangerous things are beautiful. The kind of beauty that draws your eye before your sense catches up with a warning. Dark hair pinned up with diamond pins that caught the morning light. A smile that arrived on her face with the deliberateness of something placed rather than something felt. She stepped onto the low-fitting platform without being asked, lifted her arms without being told, and said nothing to Melanie except to point twice at places where the lace felt tight across her ribs. Melanie worked in silence. That was the job. Seamstresses were furniture in rooms like this. They were not seen. They were certainly not spoken to. It was because of this invisibility that Isabel forgot she was not alone. Melanie was on her knees, adjusting the hem where it gathered unevenly at the back, when she heard the soft sound of a drawer sliding open at the vanity table. She did not look up. It was not her business. She kept her eyes on the hem and her fingers moving steadily. Then she heard the sound of something small being unstoppered. A cork pulled from glass. Still, she did not look. But the smell reached her before her caution could hold. It was faint, almost sweet. The way something rotten can sometimes smell sweet if it is far enough away. She knew that smell. She had grown up near the apothecary district, where the old herbalist women sold their knowledge in paper packets and whispered warnings. She had been 11 years old when one of the women on her street had died after her husband's evening wine began to carry that same quiet sweetness. The herbalists called it widow's breath. They called it that because it worked slowly, because by the time a person realized what was happening, the widow was already deciding how to dress for the funeral. Melanie's needle went still. She looked up. Isabel Grant was standing at the vanity mirror, drawing a small glass applicator slowly and deliberately across her lips. The vial it came from was no larger than a perfume bottle, filled with something that caught the light with an oily shimmer. Isabel watched herself in the mirror with the focused expression of someone performing a task that required precision. She was not applying color. She was applying something that had no business being on anyone's skin, and she was doing it on the morning of her wedding, the morning of the ceremonial kiss. The realization arrived in Melanie's chest, not as a thought but as a physical drop, the way the floor disappears under you in a nightmare. The Duke would kiss his bride. The Duke would press his lips to hers, and whatever was on those lips would enter him slowly, quietly, and by nightfall or the next morning, he would be dying of something no physician would be able to name in time. Melanie did not move. She could not move. Her body had made the decision to become completely still before her mind had finished calculating the danger of doing anything else. Isabel recorked the vial, set it down, pressed her lips together once, as if checking a color she was satisfied with. Then she turned and looked directly at Melanie. For one suspended moment, nothing happened. Then Isabel's smile returned. Slower this time. Different. She said, very calmly, that Melanie seemed to have finished the hem. Melanie said that she had. Isabel said she could go then. She said the footman outside would see her paid and out. Melanie gathered her things. She kept her hands steady, through an act of will she would not fully understand until later. She walked to the door. She thanked Isabel for the commission in the flat, professional tone that seamstresses use when they mean nothing at all by words. She stepped into the corridor, and the moment the door clicked shut behind her, she ran. Not out of the manor. Not yet. She was not foolish enough to run in a house full of Grant servants without a reason anyone could see. She walked quickly, the way a person walks when they are late for something ordinary, and she did not look back, and she counted doors until she found the servants' staircase and took it down 2 flights and came out through the kitchen passage into the delivery yard at the side of the house. Then she ran. The cathedral was on the other side of the city. The wedding was at midday. The clock tower above the market square read 10:15 when Melanie came through the side gate and onto the cobblestoned lane that led toward the lower bridge. She had under 2 hours. She had no horse. She had no carriage. What she had was 2 legs, and the bone-deep certainty that if she did not reach the Duke before that ceremony concluded, a man would be dead by nightfall, and she would be the only person in the world who knew why. She was halfway down the first long hill toward the river quarter when she heard the sound behind her. Boots on cobblestone, more than one set, moving fast. She did not look back. Looking back cost speed, and speed was the only thing she had. The Grant estate guards had been told to watch for her. She understood that now. Isabel had watched her leave that room, with the same calm that a woman uses when she is confident the problem will be handled before it reaches the door. The footman who was supposed to pay her had never appeared, because the footman had been sent somewhere else entirely. She was not meant to leave that yard. She had run faster than the order had traveled. She cut left at the bottom of the hill, into the tangle of narrow lanes that made up the cloth merchants' district. This was her territory. She had grown up threading herself through these alleys, cutting through dye yards and storage passages and the gaps between buildings that no one thought to guard because no one valuable had any reason to be there. The guards were bigger than her, and there were 3 of them, and they knew the city too. But they did not know it the way she did. She went through the back of a tanner's yard, across a low wall into the canal-side walkway, and then made a decision she would have called insane on any other morning, and ducked into the river steps that ran below the street level along the old eastern waterway. The steps were slick with moss, and the cold came off the water like a hand pushing back. She pressed herself flat against the stone arch of the bridge above and listened. The boots went past overhead. She waited. She counted to 30. Then she came back up through the far steps and walked briskly in the opposite direction, hugging the wall, keeping her face down, and did not breathe properly until she had put 4 streets between herself and the canal. She came out onto the main thoroughfare that led up toward Cathedral Hill, just as the first carriages were arriving for the ceremony. Grand equipages with crests painted on their doors, footmen in livery, standing at attention, women in silks that cost more than Melanie's house, men in military dress with medals she did not know the names for. She was still in her working clothes. Plain wool dress, practical boots, leather satchel over one shoulder, and her hair halfway fallen from its pins from the run. Every person who glanced at her glanced away again immediately, the way people look away from something that does not fit and they do not want the trouble of explaining. She walked straight through the middle of them. She had no other choice. The doors of the cathedral were still open. The guests were still filing in. She could see the tall stone arch of the entrance and the flicker of candlelight from within, hundreds of candles making the whole interior glow amber and gold, like something from another world entirely. She was 20 feet from the door when a hand closed around her arm. One of the Grant guards. He had circled around. He was breathing hard from the run, but his grip was not tired at all. He said she was not invited. She said she had urgent business with the Duke. He said she had no business with anyone inside that building, and that she should come with him quietly, or she would come with him the other way. She looked at his face. She looked at the cathedral doors. She looked at the guest who had just passed through them, a lord in a gray coat who had let the door swing almost shut behind him without looking back. Almost shut, not latched. She dropped the satchel. The guard's eyes went to it for half a second, the instinct to track a falling object older and faster than the instinct to hold on. She wrenched her arm free and ran through the door. What happened next, she would spend weeks trying to describe accurately and never quite manage. The interior of the cathedral was full, every pew packed with the nobility and wealth of the northern provinces. The candlelight made everything warm and golden, and the silence was the specific silence of a ceremony at its most solemn point, the priest's voice carrying clearly through the vast arched space. He was saying, "The Duke may kiss his bride." Melanie saw them at the altar. Isabel in her white lace, luminous and composed, tilting her face upward with the practiced grace of someone who had rehearsed this moment. And Adam O'Neill, the Ice Duke, standing straight as a blade in his black and gold military regalia, dark eyes steady, jaw set, the expression of a man doing what is required of him, with the thoroughness of someone who does everything that way. He was already leaning toward her. Melanie moved. She did not think. She had used up thinking on the canal steps and the tanner's yard and the 20 minutes of running that had brought her here. What was left was only the image of that vial and the smell of something sweet and deadly and the absolute knowledge that she was the only person standing between this man and whatever came after. She went up the aisle. The gasps began almost immediately, rippling back through the pews like something dropped in still water. She heard her own boots on the stone floor, loud and wrong in that beautiful silence. She saw the priest's face change. She saw Isabel's eyes open and find her and go cold in a way that confirmed everything. She saw Adam O'Neill straighten and turn, confusion breaking through the ice of his expression for the first time, one word forming on his lips. She reached the altar. She took his face in both her hands. She kissed him. The cathedral erupted. She did not hear most of what happened immediately after. There was noise, a great wave of it, voices and movement, and what sounded like Isabel's voice cutting above the rest with a clarity and fury that suggested she had been preparing that particular tone for some time. Melanie was aware of hands pulling her back, guards materializing from the sides of the nave, the cold stone floor hard under her knees when she went down. She was aware of the Duke's face above her. He was not looking at Isabel. He was not looking at the priest or the crowd or any of the dozens of people now on their feet staring at the scene at the altar. He was looking at her. His dark eyes were doing something she had not expected from a man with a reputation built on absolute control. They were moving across her face with what looked, despite every piece of sense she had, like calculation rather than rage. He was reading her. She met his eyes. She said, through the noise and the grip of the guard and the shaking, she could not stop now that the running was over, that the bride's lips were poisoned. She said he needed to listen to her. She said she had watched it done. She saw something shift in his face. Then the guards pulled her out of the cathedral entirely, and the doors closed behind them, and she was taken to a carriage she did not recognize. And the city moved past the small carriage window, in blurs she could not focus on, and she understood that she had just done something she could not undo. The O'Neill estate was nothing like the Grant Manor, where Isabel's world was silk and pale blue and deliberate beauty arranged to impress. The Duke's home was stone and shadow, and the particular quiet of a place that did not concern itself with the opinion of visitors. High ceilings, dark wood, fires burning in grates large enough to stand in, corridors that stretched away into a darkness that the candles on the walls only partially addressed. Melanie was put in a room with a lock on the outside. She sat on the edge of the chair nearest the window and looked at the grounds below and listened to the estate settle around her and tried to decide whether she had saved a man's life or simply ended her own. The door opened 2 hours later. Adam O'Neill came in alone, which surprised her. She had expected guards. She had expected the formal machinery of a powerful man exercising power. Instead, there was just him, and the door clicking shut at his back, and the way he stood in the center of the room and looked at her as if she were a problem he had not yet decided how to classify. He was still in his wedding regalia, the black coat with its gold braid and epaulets, the white shirt beneath, still perfectly pressed. He looked, in the candlelight of this plain room, exactly like what the city called him, untouchable, built from something colder than the ordinary materials men were made from. He asked who sent her. She told him no one sent her. He said that was not possible. Women like her did not walk into his wedding uninvited. Nothing in his world happened without a cause, and she was going to tell him the cause, and then they were going to have a conversation about what her employer had hoped to gain by disrupting the most politically significant marriage in the northern provinces in 40 years. She looked at him. She said, with a steadiness she found from somewhere she could not have named, that she was a seamstress. She said she had been hired to do the final fitting on Isabel Grant's wedding gown that morning. She said she had been in that dressing room for 2 hours, and during that time she had seen things she wished she had not seen and heard nothing she needed to hear, because what she saw had been enough. He said, what had she seen? She told him about the vial. She described it, the size, the shape, the dark glass, the oily shimmer of what was inside. She told him about the smell. She told him the name she knew it by from the women in the apothecary district where she had grown up. She said widow's breath. She watched his face when she said it. Nothing moved. She said the smell was unmistakable. She said Isabel had applied it to her lips with a glass applicator in the way a person applies something they have practiced applying. She said it was not done in a hurry, and it was not done by mistake. She said she had seen Isabel look at herself in the mirror afterward, with the expression of someone checking work. Silence. The fire in the grate made a sound. Wind moved against the window. Adam O'Neill looked at her for a long time. Then he walked to the window and stood with his back to her and said that Isabel Grant was the daughter of Lord Edmund Grant, one of the most respected men in the Northern Council. He said she had been raised in one of the most scrutinized households in the province. He said she was known universally as gentle and composed and completely without enemies. Melanie said she understood how it sounded. He said she was asking him to believe that a woman of that standing had poisoned her own lips on her wedding morning in order to commit a murder in front of 500 witnesses. Melanie said she was asking him to believe what she had seen. More silence. He turned. The mask was back in place, fully assembled, not a crack showing. He said she would remain in this estate until the matter had been fully investigated. He said she was not a prisoner in name, but she was not to leave the grounds, she was not to send letters, and she was not to speak to any member of his household about the events of that morning. He said if she had told the truth, he would find a way to verify it. He said if she had lied, or if she was acting on behalf of anyone who wished to damage his household, she would discover that his patience had a defined and very specific end. She said she understood. He said she did not understand yet. Then he left. 3 days passed. On the first day, a maid brought her meals without speaking. On the second, she was allowed the use of a small sitting room adjoining her chamber, where there were books and a window that looked out over the estate's formal garden, now going to seed in the late autumn cold. On the third morning, she woke to the sound of raised voices below and sat at that window for an hour listening to sounds she could not interpret. Adam came to her on the afternoon of the third day. He did not knock. He came in and sat for the first time in the chair across from hers, and for a moment he said nothing. He looked older than he had in the cathedral, or perhaps just less assembled. There was something in the line of his jaw that had not been there before, a kind of grinding tension, as if he had been clenching his teeth for 72 hours straight and was only now consciously releasing it. He said he had the vial. His man had retrieved it from the Grant dressing room before the room had been cleared. The old herbalist woman from the apothecary district, the oldest one, the one who had been trading in plant knowledge for 50 years and who had no loyalty to any house because she was too old to be frightened of any of them anymore, had confirmed what was inside. Widow's breath, slow-acting, untraceable to any physician not specifically looking for it, fatal within 18 hours of significant contact. He said it very quietly. He did not look at her while he said it. He looked at his own hands, folded on his knee, the knuckles of his right hand white where he was pressing them together. She said she was sorry. He said that was the wrong thing to be sorry about. Then he stood up, and he walked to the window, and she could see from behind him the way he was breathing, slow and controlled. The disciplined breath of a man who had decided a long time ago that he was not going to let the world see what it cost him. She did not say anything. She had learned enough in 3 days of this house to know that silence was sometimes the most useful thing she could offer him. He said the situation had become complicated. He said Isabel Grant had not yet been approached directly. She had, in the hours following the ceremony's disruption, conducted herself with precisely the kind of devastated composure that made her look exactly like a wronged woman. She had the sympathy of the council. She had her father's name. She had lawyers who were already drafting papers that named Melanie Kennedy as the primary cause of the day's scandal. The story, as Isabel was telling it, was that a deranged commoner had forced her way into a sacred ceremony and assaulted the Duke at the altar. Melanie said that was not an inaccurate description of what had happened. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. Something adjacent to it, brief and unexpected. He said the problem was that moving directly against Isabel now with only a retrieved vial and a seamstress's word as evidence, would give the Grant family grounds to challenge him in front of the full Northern Council. He said Isabel was not acting alone. He said she was the visible face of something that ran much deeper, and if he moved too quickly, the deeper thing would simply close over her like water, and he would have accomplished nothing but made himself vulnerable. Melanie listened. He said he needed time. He said he needed Isabel to believe her plan had been delayed, not defeated. He said he needed, specifically, a reason that the council would accept for why the wedding had been interrupted that did not involve the words poisoned lips or widow's breath or the entire catastrophic truth. She looked at him. He looked back. She said carefully that she was not going to like what he was about to say. He said she was probably right. He said the story he intended to give the council, the story he intended to give Isabel, and the story the rest of the province would believe before the week was out, was that Adam O'Neill had discovered, on the morning of his wedding, that his heart had belonged to someone else for some time, that the interruption at the cathedral had not been a disruption, but a revelation, that the woman who had walked down that aisle was not a criminal or a lunatic, but the woman he intended to make his duchess. The room was very quiet. Melanie said his name. She said Duke O'Neill. She said he was out of his mind. He said that was possible. He said it was also the only plan he had that kept her alive, because the moment Isabel understood that Melanie Kennedy was a witness who had survived and was currently housed in an enemy estate with a retrieved vial and a story that could destroy the Grant name, Melanie Kennedy would not remain alive for very long. She opened her mouth. He said the alternative was that he could put her in a carriage tonight and send her home to her family, and she could spend the next several weeks in a house with a leaking roof trying not to think about the kind of men Isabel Grant could afford to hire. The fire in the grate cracked and settled. Melanie looked at her own hands. She thought about her youngest brother's boots and the leaking roof and the 3 faces that would be waiting for her if she came home, and the 3 faces that would have no one else if she did not. She looked up. She said she had conditions. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted, the way the surface of very still water shifts when something moves underneath. She said her family would be relocated, not to the city, not near anything that a Grant footman could find in under a day. She said her siblings would be housed, fed, and provided for regardless of how this arrangement ended. She said she would play whatever part he required in the public performance of this fiction, but she would not be lied to privately. If he knew something that affected her safety, he would tell her. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said that those were not unreasonable conditions. She said she had one more. He waited. She said that when this was over, when the truth came out and Isabel Grant faced what was coming to her, she wanted to be present. She wanted to see it. Something crossed his face that she had not seen there before. Not warmth exactly. Something that lived next door to respect, quiet and unannounced, and perhaps as surprising to him as it was to her. He said he would see what he could arrange. And that was how Melanie Kennedy, seamstress, orphan, woman with shaking hands and borrowed boots and a satchel full of needles, became the publicly declared true love of the most feared duke in the northern provinces. She had saved his life. She had not yet decided if that was the most dangerous thing she had ever done, or only the second most. The answer to that would come later. For now, there was the estate around her, stone cold and shadow deep, and the man across the room who was putting his mask back on piece by piece, and the fact that somewhere in the city, Isabel Grant was reading the announcement that had just been sent to the council and pressing her lips together in a way that had nothing to do with poison this time. Only fury. And fury, Melanie had learned, was always the step before something worse. If you're still here after all that, it shows you find the story interesting. If so, then do me this one favor. Hit subscribe on Forbidden Secret Love Chronicles. Also, drop a comment. Tell me what you would have done in Melanie's place. Tell me. If you've ever had to make a choice between safety and doing what was right, your thoughts are always welcome here, and every single comment means the world. The library was not a room she was supposed to be in. She had understood that from the first day, the way the housekeeper's pace slowed almost imperceptibly when they passed its door during the brief tour of the estate's permitted areas, the way the woman's eyes moved to the handle as if checking it was still closed. It was the particular behavior of someone who had been instructed not to draw attention to something and had not quite mastered the art of not drawing attention to it. Melanie waited 4 days before she tried the handle herself. It opened. She told herself she was only looking for something to read. The sitting room adjoining her chamber had 3 shelves of books, and she had moved through them faster than she expected. The long evenings in the estate's enforced quiet, leaving her with nothing but time, and the kind of thinking that became dangerous if it had nothing to work on. She told herself a library was a library, and she had as much right to read as anyone housed within these walls, whatever the terms of that housing. She told herself a great many things on the way down the corridor. The library was vast. 2 full floors of shelving connected by an iron staircase that curved along the far wall, the upper level accessible by a narrow walkway with a rail. The lower floor had a fireplace and 2 large reading tables and chairs with the particular permanence of furniture that had sat in the same position for so long it had pressed its own outlines into the rug beneath. The candles on the central table were fresh, which meant the room was used, which meant she should not be here long. She moved along the lower shelves first, reading spines, running her fingers lightly across the leather. History, military theory, estate law, the dry architecture of power, the kind of reading that shaped men like Adam O'Neill and gave them the vocabulary for the world they lived in. She took the iron staircase to the upper level, without making a conscious decision to do so. The upper shelves were older. The leather here was darker, and the gold lettering on the spines had worn to a suggestion of letters rather than letters themselves. These were not reference books. These were records. Ledgers with dates stamped on their spines. Correspondence volumes bound in sets. The accumulated paper memory of the O'Neill household going back further than Melanie had years. She was not sure what made her stop at the section she stopped at. Perhaps the binding. 2 volumes sitting slightly apart from their neighbors, as if they had been pulled out and replaced recently, and not quite pushed all the way back. She stood on the walkway and looked at them for a moment before she reached out and drew the first one free. It was a correspondence volume. The dates on the cover spanned a period that ended 11 years ago. 11 years was the year the fever had taken her mother and left her alone. 11 years was also, she calculated without meaning to, the year her father had died. She had always been told he died in an accident. A fall from a horse on a night road outside the city. It had been presented to her as a fact, with the blunt finality of facts that are not to be questioned, and she had been too young and too overwhelmed by grief and new responsibility to question it. She stood on the iron walkway and opened the volume. It took her 20 minutes to find what she found, and then another 10 minutes standing in the same spot, not moving because her legs had made a decision she had not authorized. Her father's name was in that book, Thomas Kennedy, written in a hand she did not recognize across several entries spanning a period of 4 months before his death. The entries were not his own writing. They were records of meetings, of payments, of something described in careful, oblique language as the management of a problem of proximity, which was a phrase she read 3 times before she understood what it meant in the language of men who did not say directly what they were arranging. Her father had been the Duke's steward. She had known that, vaguely, the way children know things about their parents' working lives without fully understanding what those lives involved. He had served the O'Neill estate. He had known Adam's father. He had known things about the estate's accounts and the Duke's private dealings and the tangled political arrangements that governed the northern provinces. The Grant name appeared 6 pages later. Lord Edmund Grant, Isabel's father. The entries did not spell out what had been agreed. Men like Edmund Grant never put agreements into writing in language that would survive a court, but the proximity of the names on those pages, the timing of the payments recorded alongside her father's name, the phrase, "The problem has been resolved," appearing in the same entry as a date, 3 days before Thomas Kennedy's fatal ride on a dark road outside the city. None of that was accidental. None of that was the kind of coincidence that remained a coincidence when you looked at it long enough. Edmund Grant had paid someone to ensure that Thomas Kennedy never spoke about whatever he had seen in the O'Neill accounts. Her father had not fallen from his horse. Her father had been put on that road, and he had not been meant to come home from it. She stood on the iron walkway until her hands stopped shaking enough to close the volume and replace it on the shelf with the careful precision of someone who has just found something they cannot unfind and must now decide what to do with. The knowledge. She went back to her room. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the formal garden go dark in the late afternoon and did not move until the maid knocked with the evening meal. She did not eat it. Adam found her the following morning in the sitting room. Not reading, just sitting with a book open on her knee that she had not looked at in an hour. He came in the way he had begun to come in over the past week, without the full formality of their earlier interactions. The mask in place but worn differently, the way a person carries something heavy with practice rather than with effort. He took the chair across from her. He looked at her face. He asked what had happened. She told him about the library. She told him about the correspondence volume and the entries and her father's name and the date. She told him all of it, in the same steady voice she had used in the room 3 days after the wedding, the voice she kept for things that were too large for any other tone. He did not interrupt. When she finished, the room was very quiet. He said her father's name slowly. Thomas Kennedy. He said it the way a person says something they have not said aloud in a very long time. She looked at him. He said that Thomas Kennedy had been the most honest man his father had ever employed. He said he had been told the man died in a riding accident, and he had been 15 years old and grieving his own losses, and he had not questioned it. He said the word quietly, and the quiet of it was more than silence. It was the sound of a man understanding something he should have understood years ago and recognizing exactly what that delay had cost. She said she needed to know if he had known. He met her eyes without flinching. He said he had not known. She looked at him for a long time. The fire in the grate was the only moving thing in the room. Then she looked away, back at the garden window, and she said she believed him. She was not entirely sure why she believed him, only that she did, and that belief sat in her chest alongside the grief and the rage with a strange kind of weight, something that pressed down and steadied at the same time. He said her father's name belonged in the public record. He said that when this was finished, when the full truth of what the Grant household had done was laid before the council, Thomas Kennedy's murder would be part of that account. He said it would not be buried again. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said thank you. He said don't. She asked, why not? He said because it was 11 years too late, and he did not deserve to be thanked for it. That evening, for the first time since she had arrived at the estate, they ate dinner in the same room. It had not been planned as anything. The housekeeper had simply laid a second place at the small table in the study adjoining the library without being asked, and Adam had come in and sat down without comment, and they had begun the meal in the same silence that governed most of their interactions. But the silence that evening was different. It was not the silence of two people who did not know each other. It was the silence of two people who had just told each other something true and were now in the unfamiliar territory that truth creates between people who have been careful for a long time. Melanie poured her own wine without waiting for the footman. Adam watched her do it without commenting. She said, looking at her glass, that she had been trying to work out what kind of man willingly marries a woman he knows to be dangerous. He said he had not known the specific nature of the danger. She said that was a very precise answer. He said he was a precise man. She said she had noticed. He looked at her over the rim of his own glass. He said that the marriage to Isabel had been arranged by the Northern Council as part of a political settlement. He had not been in a position to refuse without exposing the investigation he had been conducting for 2 years into the Roosevelt faction of nobles who were systematically siphoning funds from the Crown's Northern account. He said Isabel's name had come up repeatedly in that investigation, He said the plan had always been to use the marriage as a mechanism to get close enough to the evidence to move against her. He said marrying her and being poisoned to death by her on the wedding day had not been the original plan. Melanie said that she had, entirely by accident, ruined something he had spent 2 years building. He said that was one way to describe it. She said what was another way. He was quiet for a moment. He said that another way was that she had walked into a situation she did not understand, with no weapons and no protection and no reason to help anyone but herself, and she had done the right thing anyway. He said that was not something he encountered with any frequency in his world. She looked at him, in the candlelight of that small room, with the formality stripped away by the lateness of the hour and the weight of what had been said earlier. He looked different than he did in the public rooms of the estate. Not softer, exactly. Something more accurate than soft. Something that was simply more present, more inhabited, as if the version of him that existed in official spaces was a silhouette, and this was the actual object that cast it. She said he did not frighten her. He looked at her sharply. She said she was aware that he frightened most people. She said she was aware that this was deliberate, and that he had cultivated it over a long period of time, and that it served him well in the world he operated in. She said she simply did not feel it when she looked at him, and she thought he should know that, because she suspected that not many people had ever said it to him directly. He was very still for a moment. Then he said very quietly that she was either exceptionally brave or she had not yet seen enough of him to know better. She said perhaps both. Something happened in his face that she had no name for. Something that arrived and passed quickly, like a light in a window seen from a moving carriage. Then he looked down at his plate, and the conversation moved to other things, safer things, the details of the masquerade Isabel had announced for the following week, the logistics of what it required, the trap they were going to set inside its gilded frame. But the evening had changed something. She felt it when she went back to her room. She did not try to name it. She was a practical woman, with practical problems, and naming things that had no immediate practical application was a luxury that had never been available to her. She simply noted it, the way you note a change in the weather, and moved on. The letter arrived on the 5th morning before the masquerade. It was delivered to Melanie through the housekeeper, which was unusual because Melanie was not supposed to be receiving correspondence, and the housekeeper's face when she handed it over was the controlled blankness of a woman who had been told not to read something and had read it anyway, and wished she had not. It was not signed. It said, in a plain and careful hand, that Isabel Grant had discovered certain information regarding the true identity of Melanie Kennedy, specifically regarding her father's former position and what that position had made him party to. It said that Isabel intended to use this information. It said that a sum of money had been found in the Kennedy family's relocated lodgings that morning, placed there without their knowledge, and that a formal accusation of theft from the O'Neill estate accounts was being prepared for presentation to the Northern Council before the week was out. Melanie read it twice. Then she took it to Adam. He read it once, standing in the corridor, and his face did nothing at all. That blankness was, she had learned, different from his ordinary composure. His ordinary composure was a choice. This was a response. The particular stillness of a man who has just been moved very quickly to a cold and functional place where emotion was not useful. He said Isabel had made her first real mistake. Melanie said that framing an innocent woman for theft did not look much like a mistake from where she was standing. He said that Isabel had revealed what she knew. She had shown her hand. She had told them, without meaning to, that she had found the connection between Melanie and Thomas Kennedy, and that she understood the threat it represented. He said that meant she was frightened. He said frightened people made the kind of errors that careful people did not. He said the masquerade was in 5 days. He said they were going to use every one of them. The night of the masquerade arrived, dressed in everything wealth could buy. The Grant estate's main hall had been transformed. Candles in their hundreds, flowers forced into bloom out of season, and arranged in columns from floor to ceiling, so that the air was thick and sweet. Guests in masks of silk and painted wood and feathers. The anonymity of the masquerade doing what it always did, giving people permission to watch each other more closely than ordinary social rules allowed. Melanie wore deep green, the same color she had worn in the cathedral, the same green Adam had chosen for her publicly announced entrance into his life, because he said that details mattered and a story needed to be consistent in its details. Her hair was dressed by the estate's own woman and pinned with a simple comb of dark stones. Her mask was small and covered only her eyes. She did not look like a seamstress from the lower quarter. She looked like a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be. Adam arrived beside her at the entrance to the hall and offered his arm without looking at her directly, the way they had rehearsed, the comfortable ease of two people who knew each other well enough not to make a performance of proximity. She took his arm. She felt the tension in it, the same tight-held quality she had felt in him all week, every piece of the plan running beneath the surface of every ordinary action, like a current under ice. Isabel was already inside. She was in white, again. Melanie suspected she was always in white, that the color was a calculation rather than a preference, innocence as armor, beauty as alibi. She wore a mask on a stick which she held before her face, and lowered with practiced timing, showing herself and hiding herself in a rhythm that managed the attention of everyone around her. Her smile, when it reached Melanie across the crowded room, was the smile of a woman who believed she had already won. The evening proceeded. There was music, and there was dancing, and there was the elaborate theater of powerful people pretending to relax in each other's company. Adam moved through it with the ease of long practice, speaking to the right people, being seen in the right configurations, doing everything the role required. Melanie stayed close and watched the room. She watched Isabel. She watched the moment, 2 hours into the evening, when Isabel's attention shifted from the crowd to the table at the center of the hall, where the formal toasting wine had been arranged in tall crystal glasses on a silver tray. She watched Isabel speak briefly to one of her own footmen, a word and a small gesture, the kind of direction that looks like nothing and means everything. She watched the footman approach the central table. She did not move toward Adam. She did not need to. Adam had seen it too. What the footman did not know, what Isabel could not have known, was that the glasses on that tray had been arranged by the Duke's own man before the first guest arrived. Every glass on that tray was the same. Every glass on that tray was clean. The glass that mattered, the one that had been treated, the one that had been prepared by Adam's man using a small residual sample of widow's breath, acquired from the same source as the original vial, was not on the central tray at all. It was in Isabel's hand. She had been given it on arrival, personally, by Adam's steward, with the particular ceremony reserved for honored guests. She had accepted it with the graciousness of a woman who expected to be honored. She had been carrying it all evening, refreshed twice by staff who were not her own. She raised it now, in response to the toast called by Lord Harwick at the far end of the room. Melanie watched. The room raised their glasses. Isabel drank. Nothing happened for several minutes. Nothing was supposed to happen for several minutes. Widow's breath was slow. That was its nature. That was what made it useful to people who needed time to be elsewhere. But Adam had not used the full compound. He had used enough to produce the first symptoms, enough to make the body's response unmistakable, not enough to complete the work. The change in Isabel's face came quietly at first, a slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness in her expression that was different from her usual controlled composure. Her hand went to her throat, a small motion, quickly suppressed. Then it was not quiet. She made a sound that no amount of composure could contain, and her hand went to her throat openly, and the glass hit the floor, and the music from the corner of the room stopped, one instrument at a time, as the people nearest her turned, and the circle of awareness spread outward through the hall in the same ripple pattern as every disaster that begins in one spot and moves outward. Isabel's eyes found Melanie across the crowd. In them was the full understanding of what had happened. Not confusion, Not fear of illness. Understanding. The specific, cold, absolute understanding of someone who recognizes the instrument being played against them. She tried to speak. What came out was not words. What came out was the beginning of an accusation that could not complete itself because her body was busy with something more urgent than her fury. Her hand went to the inside of her gown, to the place where Melanie had watched women keep small things that mattered, and came out with the vial she had apparently carried to the masquerade as insurance. And this single action, this reaching for the antidote she had brought for herself, told the room everything it needed to know. You do not bring an antidote for a poison that has nothing to do with you. Adam's voice, when it came, was very quiet. It did not need to be loud. The room was completely silent. He said he would like to know what was in the vial his former fiancée had just produced. No one answered. He said he would also like to know why the compound used in the preparation of his toasting wine matched exactly the compound that had been found on a glass applicator retrieved from her dressing room on the morning of their wedding. The silence in the hall was total. Isabel's father was in the room. Melanie could see him, could see the color leaving his face in a way that had nothing to do with shock and everything to do with a man calculating the distance between his current position and the nearest exit. He did not make it to the exit. Adam's men had been at every door since the first guest arrived. Isabel was given her antidote. She was given it because Adam was not in the business of killing people in his own ballroom, and because a living witness was worth more than a dead one in front of the Northern Council. She drank it with her hands shaking and her eyes moving around the room with the trapped, furious energy of something that had run out of space. And then Adam stepped forward and said, in the tone he used for things that were finished, that the evening was concluded, that he thanked his guests for their attendance, and that anyone with questions about the legal proceedings that would begin at first light was welcome to present them through the proper channels. He turned to Melanie. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked out of the hall together, and the crowd parted for them the way crowds part for people who have just made the room understand something it will not forget. He found her the following morning in the garden. She was sitting on the stone bench at the far end of the formal path, where the garden met the low wall, and beyond the wall the land fell away toward the distant hills. The morning was cold, the kind of cold that had real intention behind it, and she had her coat pulled close, and her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at the hills with the expression of someone who has been thinking for a long time and has finally arrived somewhere. He came and stood near the bench. He did not sit immediately. He stood in the way. He stood when he was about to say something he had prepared, and was still deciding whether the preparation had been adequate. She said he could sit down. He sat. For a while, neither of them said anything. The morning was quiet in the way mornings after large events are quiet, the world still processing the shape of what has changed. He said the council had convened at first light. He said Edmund Grant had been taken for formal questioning. He said Isabel would face the full proceedings within the month. He said the conspiracy she had represented, the faction of nobles who had been working to dismantle his position in the northern accounts, was now exposed to an extent that made it impossible to continue. She said that was what he had been working toward. He said yes. She said then it was finished. He said most of it was finished. She looked at him. He was not looking at the hills. He was looking at his hands. In that way he looked at his hands when he was deciding something. Then he looked up at her, and the mask was not there. She had seen it absent before, in private moments, but always briefly, always with the sense that it was being held in abeyance rather than truly removed. This was different. This was the expression of a man who had decided the mask was no longer the instrument he needed. He said her father's name would be entered into the official record of the investigation. He said Thomas Kennedy would be named as a man who had been murdered for knowing the truth, and who had not been protected as he should have been. He said this was not sufficient. He said there was nothing sufficient for what it actually was, but he said it would be true and it would be public, and it would stand. She said thank you again. He said she was doing it again. She said she could not help it. He said he had something else to say. She waited. He said that the arrangement between them had been designed as a temporary construction. a practical fiction built for a specific purpose. He said it had served that purpose. He said she was free, fully and completely free, to leave this estate, return to her family, and live a life that had nothing further to do with him or his complications. He said he wanted her to know that. He said he also wanted her to know that he did not want her to go. The garden was very quiet. She looked at him for a long moment, at the face that had been carved from ice, according to a city that had watched him from a distance and drawn its conclusions. At the face she had been looking at for weeks now in the small rooms and the candlelit evenings and the silences that had gradually become the most honest form of communication she had found with another person in 11 years. She said she had one question. He said she could ask it. She said when he had stood in the ballroom and offered her his arm in front of everyone, had that been for the performance, or had it been for her? He was very still. Then he said it had been for her. She said that was what she thought. He reached into his coat and produced something she recognized before she fully understood what she was seeing. Her father's name was on the official record he held, signed and sealed that morning, the document that would restore Thomas Kennedy's name and truth to the public account of the Northern investigation. He laid it on the stone bench between them. Then he reached into his coat again and produced something else. Smaller, the kind of small that comes in a velvet box that has been carried carefully and for some time. He did not open it. He said he was not asking because of the arrangement. He said he was not asking because of the political utility of having someone beside him who understood what loyalty actually required. He said he was asking because she was the only person who had walked into his world without wanting something from it and without being afraid of it. And he had spent enough of his life surrounded by people who wanted things and people who were afraid to recognize something different when it finally arrived. He said he knew this was not how proposals were made. She said she had noticed. He said he suspected she did not mind that. She looked at him. She looked at the velvet box. She looked at the document with her father's name on it. This man's first act of the morning on a morning that had given him everything he had spent 2 years working toward. She said she had conditions. Something crossed his face that was, unmistakably, the thing she had seen next door to a smile. She said her family stayed close. She said the roof got fixed. She said she would be told the truth about everything, the way she had always been told the truth once he started telling it. He said those were familiar conditions. She said she was consistent. He said he had noticed. She looked at the hills for a moment, at the cold morning light on the distant land and the particular quality of a world that had just shifted on its axis and was still finding its new level. Then she held out her hand. He opened the box. She had saved his life on a morning she had expected to be ordinary, with shaking hands and borrowed boots and no plan at all. She had not known, standing breathless at the entrance to that cathedral, that the thing she was running toward was not just a man in danger, but the life she had never been permitted to imagine for herself, the life her father had died trying to protect the possibility of. She knew now. And Melanie Kennedy, seamstress, orphan, woman who acted before she thought and told the truth before she calculated the cost, looked at the man across from her and decided that some things were worth the run. If you made it to the end of this story, I want you to stay here with me for just one more moment, because you watched Melanie run through those streets with nothing. No title, no name anyone recognized, no weapon but the truth. And you stayed with her through every chapter, every locked door, every room where the odds were against her. You stayed because somewhere in her story, you saw something real. Stories like this one exist because of you, because you clicked, because you watched, because you came back. There are more Melanies waiting, more truths buried under pretty names and white lace and locked library doors, more stories of people the world dismissed who refused to stay dismissed. If you've been watching without subscribing, this is the moment. Hit that button right now, because the next story is already waiting, and I would genuinely hate for you to miss it. Leave a comment below and tell me what Melanie meant to you. Tell me the part that hit hardest. Tell me where you're watching from. Every single comment is read. Every single one matters. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to believe that the nobody in the room can still change everything. Ring that notification bell and know that you are already part of this family. This is Forbidden Secret Love Chronicles, and we are just getting started.